Sean Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and Real Ag Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. You can listen to every day at 4:30 Eastern on Rural Radio 147, or of course, download the Real Ag Radio podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Water. Important resource. Some would like less of it coming from the sky. Some areas would definitely like more of it. Having a national water strategy, something being very encouraged from the perspective of CAPI. Joining us here right now on a new report they released last week is Tyler McCann. He's managing director at CAPI. Tyler, great to chat with you.
Thanks for having me on, Sean.
Okay, so the report, a National Agri-Food Water Action Plan. I guess off the top, what's the gap here? Do we not have one already?
No, we don't. And I think the gap is that water is an increasingly critical resource that we take for granted in Canada. And so we think that we need to think differently about water. We need to act differently about water. We made a point of not calling for a national water strategy. We have a lot of strategies out there, Sean. What we need is action. And so that's why our recommendation is that we need governments, the industry, to come together and come up with an action plan and move forward on it.
Yeah, well, the Canadian way would be to have a committee and then have that committee consult and then have a here's what we heard document and then wonder now what do we do. So you have some key takeaways in the report, and one of the things, and I think this is consistent across a number of different topics, Canada has a fragmented and siloed model for water management. Now, is this where the provinces get involved, or I guess whose jurisdiction are we talking about here?
So the short answer is it depends. The long answer is the provinces, federal government, municipalities all play a role. We've got water that crosses international boundaries, so the United States gets engaged at times. We've got farmers, processors, Indigenous groups that all have a really important role to play. And so as much as we joke earlier about the Canadian approach is let's create a committee, we do actually need people to work together. There are these clear distinctions where the province will be out front around water management within their boundaries. But, again, if you look at the prairies in particular, these issues, water flows from the west to the east across the prairies a lot of the time. We need provinces to be working together. We need to learn from what everyone's doing, and we need to be a lot more thoughtful about how we're, on one hand, we're conserving water, which will need to be conserved and be managed more sustainably, but on the other hand, about how we're leveraging it so that we can take better advantage of the asset that Canada has.
We've also got some challenges where there's international jurisdiction, right? I think of a lake not too far from me, the Koocanusa, where the water fills from the U.S. side, and that may fit a little bit. If we don't have good relations with our neighbor to the south on matters like this, there could be some real challenges. How does that factor into some of the details of the report?
Well, so it definitely does, and I think it matters on a couple of counts. I mean, the United States, in a lot of ways, is the example of what we don't want to do in Canada. If you look at the southern U.S. and you look at their inability to effectively manage their resources, is having a huge impact on ag. I mean, if you look at dairy crops, fruit and vegetables, agriculture productions being upended there. But if you also look at the role that water was a significant issue in the Canada, U.S., Mexico free trade negotiations, the potential for the U.S. to be potentially redirecting water away from Canada, it could have a significant impact as well. Again, if they're looking at what do they do to make up for their own lack of water domestically, that has a significant potential. And so we need to have a much better understanding of how those dynamics are playing out, and we need to be a lot more thoughtful. Again, I think some of that goes back to in the past we've taken water for granted. We haven't. I think some people have talked about the threat of bulk water exports, and a lot of us would just shrug our shoulders and say that's not going to happen. But if you understand actually what's happening in the United States, there may be more of a risk of that than a lot of us would like to admit.
Do you have any idea from a research perspective? Like, I know there's different universities that have, I'll just call them water institutes, or there's a chair in water research. How are we doing understanding the situation from a research perspective?
Yeah, I think that there are some real good examples of the University of Saskatchewan's got a global institute on water security. You're doing a lot of really important work. But there's a lot that we don't know. And a lot of the things that we used to think that we knew are changing because of the impact on climate change and extreme weather. So one of our recommendations is that governments need to start to invest more. We need a better long-term plan around water research, but we need to start by making some more investment. So we say as a starting point, we need to invest $18 million in mission-driven research. What that means is rather than doing what the government likes to do today and take a broad research program and say we want to have everybody do a little bit of water research, we should have a targeted call focused just around water management, and really direct our focus and intention. We tend not to do that in agriculture in Canada. We tend to sprinkle money all over the place, and results aren't very good. We need to think differently about how we invest in R&D in the space.
So some Canadians and members of the audience have maybe heard of the Canada Water Agency. What role do they play?
So we're still waiting to hear exactly what that's going to be. So the Canada Water Agency is something that's still being developed, still being rolled out by the federal government. We know it's going to be in Winnipeg, but we're waiting in more details around what its mandate should be. The report clearly points to the fact that that agency should be a facilitator and enabler, should be a place that brings provinces, farmers, other stakeholder groups together to think more thoughtfully about water management, water resources, can help fund some of this research. It should not be a regulator. I think that there's a lot of concern that you're going to see the federal government go back to some of the things that it did in the past that alienated a lot of important stakeholders, especially on the prairies. But this should be about helping to find new solutions and helping to do things differently, not about carrying the heavy hammer across the prairies.
You mentioned that the greatest impact will be achieved when governments work together. Call me cynical, but that seems like a really, really high request.
Yeah, it shouldn't be, and it's these simple things. We just got to put our differences aside and figure out how we do things together. One of the simple things is, across the country, people use different measures to measure water. So we don't have a consistent set of metrics. Surely to God, Sean, we can figure out a way to use one consistent set of measurements across the country.
Okay. So any other call to actions here from your perspective that should be happening that really will have a positive impact on the agriculture and food industry?
Yeah, I think an important piece is we need to think differently about infrastructure. I think we think a lot about irrigation and drainage. Actually, probably what we need is more flexible infrastructure that recognizes, there's going to be times of the year when we're dealing with a flood and times of the year we're dealing with a drought, and we need to be able to think differently about both of those dynamics. But first and foremost, our call to action is people need to think more about water. They need to think more about water and agriculture and food, and they need to think about, again, how do we conserve it, but also how do we leverage it?
But no different than trying to build a pipeline in this country. How the heck would you ever build a dam?
Yeah, well, we're going to wait and see what happens in Saskatchewan as they finally try and complete a project that was started 60 years ago, 70 years ago to grow their irrigation infrastructure. Hopefully, some of the changes, the federal court decisions, make it a little bit easier for Saskatchewan to move ahead with that.
You mentioned a couple times Canadians take water for granted. What is that rooted in? Is it because we just think we have a lot of it? Like, it's the abundance of it? What's creating that sort of underlying feeling about water?
So I think it is that we do have a lot of it. I think when people think about water, they think about a country full of lakes and rivers. Often we don't think about the groundwater that's there. The reality is that around the world, about 70% of freshwater withdrawals go to agriculture, but in Canada, it's only 12%. We actually don't use that much water for agriculture and food, but in part that tells me that we're not leveraging the resource the way that we should. But we have to understand that the way things used to be with water are changing. We know that they're going to change more often, and so these ideas, this stays in the past. That again, we didn't need to worry about irrigation because there's going to be enough rainfall. We don't need to spend the money. Again, I think we've seen the last couple of years that we should not be thinking that way anymore.
Is there? You mentioned the U.S. is not the model. Making U.S. media appearances, there's always lots of talk about waters of the United States and fighting over that. Is there a country out there that is taking a leadership position and is something in a country that we should maybe spend more time trying to emulate, that has some of the same geographical, I guess, constraints or context for us?
Yeah. So one of the interesting things, leadership is often driven out of a crisis. So if you look at countries that are doing well on water R&D and innovation, Israel is one of the best in the world. They're spending a lot, but that's because they don't have it. I think if you look at water management, Australia is a bit of an interesting case again, but it's become a conflict point as they have to fight between agriculture users and municipal users. And I think one of the good news, or one of the opportunities for Canada, is that we can develop a made in Canada solution, hopefully before the crisis actually hits us, so that we're not stuck in the same situation as Australia or the US, who are trying to struggle through how do you manage a situation where you don't have enough water anymore.
Is the scope of the stakeholders, when we talk about water, we're basically talking about everybody. And so trying to kind of bring this into, here's a strategy, and not just a strategy, but like you said, like here's an action plan that can be implemented, that there's big barriers here. And it's, when we get to like a consult, for example, there is everything and anything contributing to that, and everybody has a point of view, and they are not in the same ballpark. That has to be one of the barriers here.
It certainly is. And again, we're trying to put a little bit of a box around it by referring to agri-food water. Again, this agriculture ministers don't unfortunately have all of the power that sometimes we would like them to have. They're going to need to work with their environment colleagues. They're going to need to work with their natural resources colleagues. This is going to be a team effort, but at a minimum, we should have a better understanding of how much water is agriculture using, how much water does it need, what are the investments that are needed. Those are issues that agriculture itself and the community of stakeholders more closely connected to agriculture can figure out on its own.
How do we get Mother Nature to cooperate more often? She can play a big part in all this.
Yeah, and but we know that she's not going to cooperate. We're living
Yeah.
through that today. So how do we better plan, adapt, and mitigate to the challenges that she's throwing at us?
Tyler, if somebody wants access to the National Agri-Food Water Action Plan report that CAPI has published, where do they find it?
Yeah, they should go to our website, www.capi-icpa.ca. We've got a webinar coming up next week. They can find the details on that on our website as well.
Awesome stuff. Tyler, thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you, Sean.